Let's take a look now at Section 4 of Chapter 4 of the GDPR, and this deals with the Data Protection Officer. So throughout the GDPR up to now, we've heard mention of this DPO, Data Protection Officer, a few times. And many of the articles in the GDPR require the Data Protection Officer to be identified and the contact details of that person to be made available. While some of the requirements of the GDPR clearly represent business opportunities for business involved in consultancy or in compliance, the role of the Data Protection Officer certainly represents a career opportunity for someone who's interested in this kind of thing. If you've gotten this far in this series of videos, then perhaps you might be interested in such a role. So Section 4 sets out what the role of the Data Protection Officer is and the kinds of things the Data Protection Officer needs to be able to do. So Article 37 specifies that the controller and the processor shall designate a Data Protection Officer. Now, a Data Protection Officer is only required in certain situations. But a great many organisations appoint a Data Protection Officer anyway. So a Data Protection Officer is required where there is processing carried out by a public authority or body. So a place like MTU has to have a Data Protection Officer. A health authority has to have a Data Protection Officer. So wherever there's processing done by any kind of government or sort of government agency, straight away there's a Data Protection Officer required there. If the core activities of the controller or processor consist of processing operations which require regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, then a Data Protection Officer is required. If there's any processing of data referred to in Article 9, that's the special categories like religion, sexual orientation, racial information, or Article 10, which is criminal offences, then straight away we also need a Data Protection Officer to be appointed. Article 37.2 is just an administrative provision. A Data Protection Officer can be appointed to be the Data Protection Officer for a group of undertakings. So the Data Protection Officer can be double jobbing or triple jobbing across 2 or 3 organisations. Article 37.5 just specifies that the Data Protection Officer shall be designated on the basis of professional qualities and in particular expert knowledge of data protection law. So the person needs to be qualified, but the GDPR doesn't actually specify what those qualifications should be. There is a lot of business being done by companies offering courses in the GDPR to people who might need to take on the role of Data Protection Officer. And there's a fair bit of money being made there, in fact. But you certainly don't have to have a law degree or be a lawyer. And of course, as you know, there are lots of college courses as well that might qualify one to be a Data Protection Officer. The Data Protection Officer can be a member of staff of the controller, or it can be someone who's doing that job as a contractor. So again, you could actually have a business where you're a Data Protection Officer for a number of companies and you come in, once a month or whatever and do your thing. If there's documentation need to be provided, you do that. If there were queries, people contact you and you make sure they're dealt with. In many of the articles in the GDPR, it is very specific that the contact details of the Data Protection Officer must be provided. And we see this again in Article 37.7. The controller or processor shall publish the contact details of the Data Protection Officer and communicate them to the supervisory authority. So if a data subject has an issue, it's very easy to identify the individual person that's the contact point. So it's not the Data Protection Department, it's not the legal department, it's not customer service. It's a very specific named person whose contact details are published. And that's very important. It allows the data subject to identify the person to deal with. So what does the data protection officer do then? Well, as we've seen, there are mentions of the data protection officer throughout the GDPR, but there are some specific provisions here in Article 38. So the controller and processor shall ensure that the data protection officer is involved properly and in a timely manner in all issues which relate to the protection of personal data. So if there is an issue about personal data in the organisation, the data protection officer must be involved. The controller and processor shall support the data protection officer in performing the tasks referred to in Article 39. We're going to look at those in a second, by providing resources necessary to carry out those tasks and access to personal data and processing operations, and to maintain his or her expert knowledge. So you can't just appoint someone and forget about them. They do need access, and they do need training, and they do need resources. Article 38.3 then is very interesting. It says that the controller and processor shall ensure that the data protection officer does not receive any instructions regarding the exercise of those tasks. So the data protection officer acts like an internal auditor. The data protection officer must have the freedom to perform the tasks. So he or she shall not be dismissed or penalised by the controller or the processor for performing his tasks. So if you try to fire the data protection officer, there could be some very interesting complications there. The data protection officer shall report directly to the highest management level of the controller or processor. Now that's a very interesting and very specific provision that I think you very often don't see acted upon. In a lot of organisations, the data protection officer might be somewhere there in admin or somewhere there in the IT department, and they're typically not very high up the organisational chart, but the data protection officer must report directly to the highest person in the organisation. Now, very often the data protection officer does the data protection job part-time. So they may have a particular role, and then 1/5 or 1/4 of the time they're allocated goes to the data protection officer role. But in the capacity as the data protection officer, the DPO reports directly to the person at the top of the company. So if the person at the top of the company has never met the data protection officer, well, you've an issue there right away. That says that something is not being done right. Given we've seen so much in the GDPR about providing the contact details of the data protection officer, it's no surprise then that data subjects may contact the data protection officer with regard to all issues related to the processing of their personal data and to exercise their rights. So the data protection officer is the contact person. And again, it's important that it is a person. There's not a data protection department that the data subject contacts. There's a data protection officer that is one person who is identified. Needless to say, the data protection officer shall be bound by secrecy or confidentiality concerning the performance of his or her tasks. That's not shocking or surprising. And as I mentioned earlier, the data protection officer may fulfill other tasks or duties. But the controller or processor shall ensure that any other tasks or duties do not result in a conflict of interest. So the head of the IT department probably shouldn't be the data protection officer. So you need to make sure that there's no conflict of interest there. And it can be quite a delicate balancing act for the data protection officer. the data protection officer has to, in essence, put the needs and the concerns of data subjects ahead of the concerns of the organization, and has to sort of speak up for that person. That can be a strange position to be in. It can be difficult to be the person that's always saying, hang on a minute here now, I don't know if that's a good idea, or to be the person that's always saying no when someone wants to do something. But of course, having that voice can protect the organization. That advocacy is in the long-term interests of the controller. Article 39 then specifies some of the things that the data protection officer will actually do. So the DPO will inform and advise the controller and the processor and the employees who carry out the processing of their obligations. So there's a communication function there and an education and training function there. The data protection officer will monitor compliance with the GDPR and monitor compliance with the policies of the controller and the processor. And again, Part B specifies the awareness raising and training of staff involved in the processing operations. The DPO will provide advice into data protection impact assessments, and if there is one, it'll monitor its performance. The data protection officer is also the contact point for the supervisory authority, and so obviously the data protection officer will cooperate with the supervisory authority when needed. In Article 39.2, then, more generally, the data protection officer shall, in the performance of his or her tasks, have due regard to the risks associated with processing operations, again taking into account the nature, scope, context and purpose of the processing. So that's the role of the data protection officer. You can see that the GDPR isn't very prescriptive, but it is a very big job, and it could actually be quite an interesting job also. And for anyone with documented and accredited expertise in the GDPR, it certainly represents either a business opportunity or a career opportunity within your employment.